I know.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Northshire Live. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rachel Person. I'm the event manager for Northshire Bookstore in Saratoga Springs, New York. Here, as I so often am these days, with my good friend and colleague, David Wood, event manager for Northshire Bookstore in Manchester, Vermont. A couple of quick notes before we get started. First of all, as you're coming in, you probably see that we are recording this evening's presentation for later broadcast on our YouTube channel. However, fear not. We have the settings arranged so that only those of us who are unmuted and speaking in this lovely yellow box will be recorded. So you can have your camera on and you will not be picked up for posterity. In light of that, please use the chat throughout the evening for any comments or questions that you have. You can put them right into the chat and we will see them there. And then last of all, a word of thanks. Independent bookselling is a strange and hard business. Even in very good times, and the last couple of years have not been very good times for any independent businesses. And all of us at both Northshire bookstores are very, very aware that we would not be here without the incredible loyalty and support of customers like you. We are deeply, deeply grateful for that, and we thank you for being here tonight and for your continued support of Northshire bookstores. Without further ado, David, why don't you go ahead and introduce our guest this evening?
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's my great pleasure tonight to welcome to Northshire Bookstore a major new Vermont writer, Nathaniel Ian Miller, author of the new novel, The Memoirs of Stockholm SVEN. Nathaniel is a former resident in the Arctic Circle Expeditionary program and raises beef cattle in central Vermont. He's written for Virginia Quarterly Review and for newspapers in Wisconsin, New Mexico, Montana, and Colorado, for which he received multiple Associated Press awards. The Memoirs of Stockholm SVEN is his first book and was selected by independent booksellers across the country as the #1 Indie Next Picks for this month. Reviewers have called it a truly walloping tale of solitude and survival, ceaselessly brilliant and beautifully stark and unimaginably rich. It's a Northshire Staff Pick from Stan Hines, who said in his review that Miller takes a sad, broken character living in desperate isolation in a barren and beautiful landscape and creates a stunning meditation on friendship, compassion, and familial love. I fell deeply in love with this beautiful, heart-swelling novel. And we are lucky tonight to be joined by New York Times bestseller Christina Baker Kline, author of 8 novels, including Orphan Train and The Exiles, both of which are also Northshire Staff Picks, and 5 nonfiction books that are together published in 40 different countries. Please join me in welcoming to Northshire Bookstore, Christina Baker Kline and Nathaniel Ian Miller.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, obviously in the service of Nathaniel. Nathaniel, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
I'm so delighted to be here, and I think everyone is. I mean, so your book, which I read, okay, wait, let's step back for a second. I just want to say that, I get a lot of books to blurb, and yours was one of, I have to admit, lately, because I've been so busy, I'm working on a novel. I don't usually take books by people I don't know anything about, but your editor wrote an incredible letter, and your book that I read the first 5 pages of before I agreed to read it, the whole thing, was so incredibly captivating that I couldn't say no. And in fact, the whole thing is like a fever dream. It's just the most entertaining book. And it is the #1 indie pick for independent bookstores in America this month, which is a huge deal. So Nathaniel, how does that feel? Let's start with that.
I don't know if I can answer that question, Christina. First of all, thank you for doing this. I mean, I don't have the words to express what it means to me to have you here with me. But I feel overwhelmed. I feel overjoyed. It's been quite a long road getting this to publication, getting myself to publication. And I know it's an overused word these days, but still processing it. I think it's a little bit difficult to to pull out of the abstract in our sequestered, cloistered, still pandemic times where we're all, most of us still living in bubbles, to know. So I have a sort of perpetual curiosity about what it's doing in the world right now, if anything. And so I have a lot of curiosity about it, but it's wonderful.
So Nathaniel, you wrote this book. It took a while. And what I'd like to, I think the readers would love, or our viewers for now, they will be readers of your book, I'm sure. But what our viewers would love to know is how you would describe the book, first of all. And then I'd love to hear something of your journey toward writing it.
Sure. I think of the book as, well, so for those who aren't familiar with it, it's written in the form of a fictional memoir, obviously, I guess, but I find it hard to characterize in terms of genre, and maybe every writer suffers from this problem, but you could call it historical fiction. Mostly, it's a story of community, one's chosen community. I thought it was going to be a story of pure isolation when I first conceived of it. And so it was a surprise to me as Sven evolved on the page that it was so much a story of bonds and connection. So maybe that's how I would characterize it. And as far as the journey of writing it, it began with an artist residency at sea called the Arctic Circle. We went to Svalbard, formerly known as Spitsbergen, and still known as Spitsbergen in some areas. And
Sweden.
So this is north of Norway, about basically halfway between Norway and the North Pole, and governed by Norway. And it's an island archipelago, a rich history of both whaling and polar exploration and disasters. And as part of this residency, we voyaged aboard a traditionally rigged tall ship. We didn't circumnavigate the archipelago, but went a fair ways around the western and northern side of it. And most of the people aboard were artists in other forms. I was the only writer aboard, or the only strictly writer. And so we saw many things. I took many notes, just soaking it in. But at the time, I thought I was going to write about the old horror heyday of polar exploration. And up on the northern end of the archipelago, we were in this remote fjord, and were able to step inside the hut, Rodfjordhytta, of the real Stockholm Sven, who is this former miner, maimed in a catastrophic mining accident, avalanche, who removed himself to this fjord for, as far as we know, the remainder of his days. And very little is known about him, almost nothing, certainly nothing for sure. So 99+% of the book is pure fiction. But stepping inside that hut sparked a new idea, a new direction for me with my project. And I knew I needed to tell the story of whoever had chosen willingly to alienate himself so extravagantly as to live in this. It's hard to put into words how remote this area is. I mean, I think sometimes where we live is remote, but nothing like Rodfjorden and Svalbard. So that's my rambling answer.
So Nathaniel, how did you end up in the Arctic Circle Expeditionary program? What was that process for you as a writer, given that there were no other writers there?
I'd been trying to find a way to the Arctic or Antarctic, but Arctic is a little easier, for many years. I have a long-standing obsession with polar history, polar exploration. My mother introduced me to Alfred Lansing's Endurance when I was very young. And that started this amassing of I mean, I wish you could zoom in on some of these shelves of.
Well, I'm noticing photographs on my left. You're
Yes.
right.
There-
Are those part of research for you?
Some are for sure, and some were taken on that residency, but obviously prohibitively expensive to try to get up there and spend any real time as anything other than a tourist. So this residency, which I can't remember how I found out about it, but it was the way for me to get there and get a firsthand sense of what the polar regions were really like.
So you got up there and there were other kinds of artists. Were you inspired by any of them while you were
Sure.
there, actually?
Absolutely. You couldn't help but be some, and I'm still in touch with several of them. This is now 9 years later, but some tremendous visual artists, musicians, just the way that they could translate that experience into a medium that I can't really even begin to articulate. It's still beyond me. And I envied the fact that while in the Arctic, they could actually make art.
Produce, right? Yeah.
And that, I mean, there were some logistical problems for sure in terms of cold hands, cold paint, cold machinery. I was just out there scribbling notes and pages and pages and pages. So for me, everything had to be deferred until I could get home and stew over it.
And kind of make sense of what you had.
Yeah.
But I would say that is true. I mean, for any of you who are with us tonight, and some, I would suspect that some of you are writers or artists, and maybe some of you have also been to writers' colonies. I've never been to the Arctic, but I've done some writers' colonies, and I will say that the most exciting thing is when you're with a bunch of artists who aren't writers necessarily. It's always nice to be with other writers, but being exposed to, as you said, composers and visual artists is really fertile ground for all kinds of things. So it's fun to hear about that. So Nathaniel, what I'd love for you to do, if you don't mind, is to take maybe 2 or 3 minutes and read us a little bit from your book.
I'd be happy to. I think I'll just start right at the very beginning. Seems like the way to do, just in case anyone hasn't read it, and I don't want to give anything away. So, prologue from a tiny cabin by the ocean. My name is Sven. To some, I am known as Stockholm Sven, and to others, Sven One Eye or Sven the Seal Fucker. I arrived in Spitsbergen in 1916. I was 32 years old and hadn't amounted to much. I have some sense of what is said about me by the few who might say anything at all, that I lived entrapped alone in the great bay and hunting grounds of Rodfjorden in the farthest north, that I was the pitiable victim of a mining accident, that I had irrepressible eccentricities and abjured society. This is all true in a way, and yet less than true. And let it be struck from the record that I was a talented and enthusiastic cook, as some have claimed, for that is a flagrant falsehood. I expended the greater part of my life in Spitsbergen, an island archipelago due north of Norway, whose uppermost reaches are but a handful of degrees from the invisible pole. These days, the place is called Svalbard by politicians, generals, and cartographers, or by all but the most precious few, it is called nothing, for the age of exploration is long over, and if Spitsbergen still dwells in the popular imagination, it exists only as a faint echo, a half-remembered word. How's that, Christina?
I'm unmuting myself. That was fantastic. So I think you all get a sense of the voice of this novel, which is so distinctive and original. And it just, as I said, I read the first, 10 pages and was just utterly captivated. So he has this distinctive voice and personality, unlike anything I think I've read. And I wondered, how did that come to you? How did you develop that?
Certainly, some of it developed unconsciously, and I would be lying to say otherwise. But I have to admit, there's a fair amount of me in there. And
in what way?
Certainly, in terms of the tendency to reflect deeply and inwardly, and this sort of perpetual doubt and need for space, and I mean, there's more similarities than I care to admit, but he's also an amalgamation of all of the things he's read. So Sven as a character is odd in his society in that he's a bibliophile, and he reads anything he can, and he comes from a family that doesn't really read. So he is.
Is that true for you, Nathaniel?
No, that's the opposite for me, fortunately. But yes, so he's absorbed, and he wouldn't have had access to much, but he has found and absorbed tons of the polar narratives. So if his language is a little flowery at times, a little bit grandiloquent, that's really why. And also just because I like using that type of language. But I tried to give him a sort of archaic but sensitive tone.
I think it's a hard balance to strike in a story like this, where there are a lot of reasons for him to feel sorry for himself, as a character. He's,
yes.
He's sort of banished to the end of the earth, self banished in some ways, but he's disfigured, and people react with horror to him, and he's figured out a way to live. In some ways, it reminded me of the Frankenstein story, I mean, and also the idea of the ice floes and the, Great North and all of that. I wondered if what sources from literature maybe have influenced you as you worked on this.
Sure. So I'm a huge fan of Dame Beryl Bainbridge. And she wrote a book called The Birthday Boys. It's hard to find, and anyone who's listening, I hope you can find a copy. It's worth finding a copy. She was known maybe best, maybe this isn't true, but she spent so much time writing this, what do they call it now, autofiction? But she wrote beautiful historical fiction, and elliptical and concise and insightful. And so Birthday Boys is about Robert Scott's failed attempt to reach the South Pole. And it's dark and gorgeous. So that was always in my head in a big way. And also a lot of the language that I took in through osmosis comes from Patrick O'Brien's Aubrey Maturin series, which I've read and listened to and read again and listened to again. It's just like, it's running through my blood on a regular basis. The language is so rich and specific to a different era. It's, I guess you would call that the Georgian era, Napoleonic Wars. But in terms of nautical language and the way sailors might speak to one another. So that played a big role. And then the third major input is a book called The Long Ships by Franz Bengtsson, a Swedish novel written, I think, in the 40s or 50s about Vikings. And it is a deeply funny book and brilliant. And I think of Bengtsson's characters as godparents in a way to Sven and company.
So we have a fun question. I think it's a direct message to me, so you may not see it there, but it's from Dafid. I'm pronouncing that wrong. Saying, which books would Sven have had access to? Which I think is a great question, actually.
Sure. and without claiming to know more than I do about the state of Stockholm's libraries in the early 20th century, which is nothing, I can say that he would have had access to the polar narratives because those were widely distributed at the time. So men who wrote their narratives, such as in his era, Amundsen, and earlier, such as John Franklin, I think he would have seen, even in translation. And that, at least as far as Sven is concerned, makes up his seminal reading education.
Yeah.
But later on in the book, he is suddenly given access to a whole nother world of literature through his friend Charles McIntyre, who is a much more widely read bibliophile and gives him things like Michel de Montaigne and all kinds of things that influence Sven as he grows as a human being.
Yeah, I want to talk about Charles McIntyre in a moment, but what I'd love to, you brought up John Franklin. And so part of the reason that, of course, I'm so smitten with this book and the story of it is that I got completely obsessed with John Franklin. That's my novel, The Exiles. So, I'm in New York City, so you're probably hearing, sorry, you're hearing.
I was looking out my window.
Sirens, despite the double glazed window. But so John Franklin was an Arctic explorer who, before his idiotic, ill-fated expeditions that were filled with hubris and ego, he was governor of an island sort of nation in Australia called Tasmania, and where he was in charge of all these convicts. And that's what I write about in The Exiles. But I fell down a rabbit hole that I had serious trouble getting out of about John Franklin's Arctic expeditions and what an idiot he was and how he screwed up time and time again and got promoted nonetheless. He became knighted. You know, his wife was a striver and she helped agitate to get him knighted. And then he would do another Arctic expedition where there was questions of cannibalism, and then he would get another one. You know, there was all this. And finally, of course, he crashed and burned in a spectacular way, disappearing into the ether. And we're still today piecing together what happened. But those stories of Arctic exploration are so interesting. And the personalities, Nathaniel, are so interesting.
They really are. And I mean, I love what you do with John Franklin as such a complicated, deeply problematic character in The Exiles. I think you really give him this pathos that I mean, I think he does get characterized as just the fool, but
Yeah.
there was more there. I mean, he was a terrible planner. Of course, so was Shackleton, but we hail him as a hero.
I know, it's so fascinating.
It is fascinating. But yes, Franklin, so I wrote a short story that really started my writing process about the Arctic. I wrote a short story about John Franklin and the Coppermine expedition, his overland expedition in Canada.
Okay, I'm going to be demanding that from you because I really want to read it.
And that's the one where he earned the nickname, the man who ate his boots.
Right.
So,
yeah,
I mean,
I love all the boot and many other things that he
and
ate.
many other things. But yeah, it's so many bizarre characters from the age of polar exploration. And I love to pair it with Scandinavian polar exploration because they just went about everything so differently.
Okay, let's talk about that. Talk about that a little bit. Yeah. How are the
Sure.
English different from the Scandinavians? And what did the Scandinavians do that was better?
Sure. I hope I won't butcher any of the history, but more boiling it down in a reductive way. The British, their long storied history of exploration, both poles, tended to go about things in a bullheaded way in terms of this is the way things had to be done. They were never going to speak to the indigenous people or ever try to learn anything from them or how they did things. They were going to use the biggest ships they had. They were going to let them get locked into the ice, or say they were going overland in the Antarctic. They're going to take ponies. And, you know, damn it all, if ponies just they're gonna survive in the Antarctic. And then so you'd have Norwegians or Swedes. Swedes is another story, because classically we talk about Solomon Andre, who tried to go up to the North Pole in a balloon. That was catastrophic in its own way. But people like Nansen, Fridtjof Nansen, and his successor, Roald Amundsen, they learned, first they adapted, they innovated. Nansen went up there with a round hulled ship, so that when the ice locked in around him, the ship could just sort of bounce up out of the ice. Much smaller, small crew, so that people could stay fed and not maintaining this huge apparatus. Or you have Amundsen in Antarctica later on, years later, using dogs, a much more reasonable approach than ponies and motors and things like that. So yeah, very different mentality.
Very different mentalities. Nathaniel, have you ever had an impulse to do that?
I would say, especially when younger, I had a number of self-destructive impulses like that to test myself. That's something I kind of lampoon a little bit in the book, in that I, like Sven, would probably do very poorly in any sort of extreme test of my capacity as a human. When I get hungry, I'm useless. I'm irritable and useless. So forget it. And I would be eating people on the first day, and be a disaster.
Or
So,
the dogs, at least.
right. Well, I don't know. Maybe I'd let the dogs eat me, but yeah. So no longer do I wish to break myself against, against the ice.
Okay, so what's changed? Why not?
I think it's, well, I hope that I've grown into some self-preservation. I'm 42 or 43 now. I have an 8-year-old son. I as a farmer, and I raise cattle and pigs, and we make hay, and I have a keen awareness of just how little it takes to break my body down year after year. And it doesn't take any extreme sort of crucible in the Arctic or the Antarctic or the rainforest. I don't need that to just break my body into little pieces that never quite heal from one year to the next.
Okay, I'm going to shift to just say that as a writer, I so admired how you built this character of Sven, because he is so appealing. He's on the surface unappealing, right, to the people around him. I mean, he describes himself as a pariah, essentially, but he's so soulful, and there's so much humor in your portrayal of him and self-awareness that the reader is immediately, I think, smitten with him. And that is one of the gifts of fiction, in my view, really good fiction, which is that you can get under the skin of a character and show what it is about them, even if they're ostracized from society or they feel completely alone. The ability that if you're skillful, as you are, you can, the author really can convey the specialness of this character. And one of the people commenting in our chat here says that Linda says, I'm really loving the humor of the book. So talk a little bit about the tone of the book and how you created this character of Sven so that he is this incredibly appealing character to the reader, even though he's either invisible or even repulsive to some of the people in his own real life.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I can only dream of doing it like you can, Christina. So I'm honored to hear that from you. But I would say, to be honest, I wrote a novel before this novel, and it's unpublished, and it's about a fallout shelter. So it's extreme isolation, but unrelenting. And it takes a very different approach in that instead of pushing the individuals, the characters, to form tighter bonds or to somehow escape, whether psychologically or physically. It's really about the ways in which isolation can break people down. And it's not a funny book, and it's not a particularly fun book. So I guess I shouldn't be surprised that it's still unread by all but myself and my wife. But I wrote this book as almost like a funhouse mirror image, in that here we have these similar themes, what isolation can do to a person. But I realized what would make it interesting, maybe to me, first and foremost, as the person writing it, was to give Sven warmth.
Mhm.
And that proved easy to do from the beginning as his character developed and his nuances accumulated and grew. It just felt natural to make him a likable person. And all of a sudden, I wanted to give him more likable people to talk to. And I realized that that was the story I was telling here. And I guess I'm repeating myself from earlier in our conversation, but it seemed that isolation for him, and I do think that he's in many ways a humble person even before he's maimed, and that especially once afterward, he's probably someone who would characterize himself as the least interesting person in the room.
Mhm.
I think he lives through his bonds, and that gives, and I know I'm rambling here, but I do think that what makes him someone you'd want to spend time with, someone whose memoir hopefully you'd want to read, and someone who others might wish to befriend in his bizarre existence, is his warmth and his sense of humor.
Okay, first of all, you were definitely not rambling. I know this is your first event for this book, but I just want to say, don't ever say that again, because you're not.
Okay.
What
All
people
right.
are here for. They want to hear what your character is. And I actually want to ask you to ramble a bit more and
Okay.
tell us how did you create warmth? What is that like? Because I know we have some writers here, and I think it's interesting to think about the creative process and what it takes to imbue a character with warmth. I will tell you that I think the failure of many a book is the inability to create a character that you want to spend time with. And you actually really want to spend time with Sven in this novel.
That's such a good and such a difficult question, Christina. I would say in some ways I've observed and copied others doing it better, like yourself, like Patrick O'Brien, writing friendships, deep connections. But also, for me, I think, and there are writers who I really admire, and I guess I won't name them here because I'm about to also criticize them, which is that and books I just adore, where I still come away from it feeling like, oh, the writer hated his character, or hated her character, hated their character, and everyone else in it. And for me, that creates a distance to feel it evident, either because of a self-conscious process or some sort of remove from the characters as though they were specimens under a microscope or something. That's where the warmth does not appear. And so in some ways, I write in opposition to that, as someone who, even if I'm writing a truly despicable character, even somebody like in this book, Sigurd, the morose Norwegian, he's really an unpleasant person, and yet I care about him, and I want that to come through. And so I guess I can't say how I do it other than it's like radical empathy, I guess.
It's radical empathy. I was thinking there's a kind of joy in people's complexity. And I'm reading Gary Steingart's new novel, Our Country Friends, which is, by the way, so fantastic. I love it so much. And the reason is that he writes about prickly, difficult, complicated, in some ways unlikable characters whom he embraces fully as the writer. And so you have and he's doing this sort of Chekhovian, narrative perspective where you're swooping in and out of people's heads, even animals' heads. And it's just delightful. But it feels like you're getting a real sense of people from the inside, and you're also seeing their foibles at the same time. And I think you do a great job of that with Sven. Like there's no question that we understand, that he's prickly and difficult and grumpy, and there's all of this. But at the same time, you create enough room in the portrayal for us to kind of adore him and to feel very much invested in his journey. And I think that's a difficult balancing act. And to your point earlier, I think a lot of people don't do that. And you can feel it. And there's a sort of wholeness to the characterization that I think is very compelling about this book. So one of the questions, and we have some questions that have come in, so I'm excited to get to them, but I'm going to ask you this. Charles McIntyre, you mentioned earlier, comes in at a certain point, and you had mentioned that you weren't sure whether, as you were writing the first draft, whether Sven would be completely on his own. So how did that character come in, and why, and how did it work in the story, and what was useful about him?
I think there are elements to the way characters are introduced in this book that are just pure fantasy. In that here we have this place, yes, naturally, society's cast-offs will find their way there, and there will therefore be interesting, eccentric individuals there. But also, there's some wish fulfillment in wanting to populate it with people I might like to spend some time with, or I might wish that I had encountered in some of my travels and journeys in life in remote places. And so in that sense, McIntyre, as the first major other character, we really spend some time. I guess Olga comes before, but McIntyre is in some ways the perfect guardian angel for Sven. He shows up out of nowhere. I hope he's believable. I did my best, but in some ways, yeah, it's a bit of fantasy to have such a generous person show up, generous with his time, his space, his books, his whiskey, his tobacco. He cares for Sven, but as he admits in their first conversation, he hasn't chosen him for any particular reason other than that he knows Sven likes to read and he's looking for somebody to talk to.
That's a huge reason, Nathaniel. And to your point earlier about like going on this Arctic expedition and going on, as you said, the Arctic Circle program, and also for me going to various writing colonies, or anything where you're thrust outside of your own life, this happens all the time. So it did not feel that it didn't feel engineered. It felt like that's the kind of kismet that you have when you take a chance and do something really brave and unusual and sort of, go off somewhere. The idea that people would be connected by books, it makes perfect sense, I think.
Yeah. I think that where things maybe stretch somewhat is that a writer's retreat or a colony or an artist's residency is going to lend itself to interesting individuals who want to connect, whereas a mining camp is going to, by definition, have less chance of meeting a like-minded individual, I suppose. But certainly there's always room for surprise.
And the idea of writing books where readers connect with each other is kind of fun. That's part of the joy, I think, of reading novels like this, is seeing other people who love to read as well. There is something in that too. So let me ask you, I'm going to ask you a question from Linda. She says, related to this question about Scandinavia that we were talking about earlier, is or will the book be published in Norway or Sweden in translation?
That is one of my dreams. From the beginning, I had this fantasy, and you're using the word fantasy again, but I had this notion, a daydream, that because anyone who's read the book will know that I like to play the different Scandinavian cultures off of one another. And they're always making these gross stereotypes about each other in the book. And I have this vision in my head of it being in translation in Sweden and Norway, and people laughing about how wrong I got it. That just gives me so much joy to imagine. But no, there's no contract yet for it to be in translation up there. There's a French translation in the works, Russian, Lithuanian, and I believe that's it so far. But because I have this UK publisher, John Murray Press, they're sending out the English language version throughout Scandinavia to wherever English language books might appear in various bookshops. So until then, at least, there's a chance that somebody up in Svalbard might be able to get a hold of it.
I think it's going to happen. I will tell you from my long experience as a very old person that it does take sometimes years. And, I am pretty certain that this is going to happen for you because you're already getting such buzz here. And how could they not? How could they not publish this? Also, the cover is so beautiful. And the whole presentation is so wonderful that I'm pretty optimistic about it. So speaking of that, actually, Karen asks, is there a particular reason for your interest in Scandinavia? Do you have Scandinavian heritage?
Zero, not even an ounce. No, in terms of heritage, if there's anyone in this book who has similar background to me, it's Ilya. I come from many variants of Ashkenazi Jews, and so in some ways Ilya is stand-in for me ethnically, and I have a thing about wanting to see as well, because I guess I'll back up for a second, and I'm getting off track, but in addition to always wanting to see representations of strong female characters, and as a reader, and always wishing to see representations of queer characters in a sort of taken for granted way, I do also like to see good representations of Jewish people in books as one. I mentioned Franz Bengtson in the beginning of our conversation. In The Long Ships, which is about Vikings, there is such a strange and wonderful depiction of a Jewish character as strong, likable, interesting, all the things that you generally don't see often enough. And so getting back to the question, no, I have no blood background to Scandinavia. I love Scandinavian literature and arts, and I'm just drawn to it.
Yeah. So I want to tell everyone that you did the coolest thing. As you know, I read Nathaniel's book. I loved it. I wrote a blurb about it. And then he reached out to me, and that was great. And then when your book was ready, when it was ready to see as a real book, which is right here, as you guys all know, I'm sure, but I read it long before when it didn't yet look like this. You also sent me, and this is just the coolest idea for any of you writers out there. Let me just say how incredible this was for me to get. So Nathaniel sent me this book called The Secret Island. And he says, "Hi, Christina, do you know this one? It's one of my favorite works of nonfiction, very odd. If nothing else, check out The Island of Ox, page 103. The chapters can be read out of order." So I read the chapter, first of all, that he recommended first. And it's so horrifying and so macabre. It's about an explorer on an island it's an island of death, essentially. It's filled with birds that don't have predators, and they're dive bombing and eating each other and dying all over this island. And it's this incredible nightmarish tale. And I appreciated it so much. And I said, I can never unread this chapter now. And it makes me, of course, want to read the rest of the book. But it was such a great gift for a writer whose book you love to send you a book that might have been an influence or might have had some kind of sway over him. So Nathaniel, explain what this book is exactly and why you sent it to me.
Sure. There was a time when people knew Franklin Russell's name before he kind of disappeared from the cultural imagination. But I think I'm gonna get this wrong. I think he wrote for the New Yorker for a number of years. But I also think he was Canadian. I hope I'm not wrong about both those things. But he wrote a book called Watchers at the Pond, which was better known than this one. The book that you're holding is his sort of travelogue, nature writing memoir about exploring various islands off of the coast of the Maritimes. And for me, as someone who loves nature writing but is very particular about it, I think he in particular, and that chapter more than anything.
I recommend it, by the way.
Oh, it just it epitomizes what one can do when one sort of looses the confining strictures of nature writing and goes, in this case, to a very dark place. And yet it's not, I don't find it depressing. It's bleak, but I don't know. I get some joy.
It's not depressing at all. I mean, he has this sort of plucky sensibility where he's also quite philosophical about it. You know, all of this makes him think about life and death the way your character does. I mean, I think that's what I loved about reading it, is that I did this deep dive into this book after reading Memoirs of Stockholm Sven, which is quite philosophical, right? In a lot of ways. I mean, you're alone. This character is alone. He's in this remote place and he is thinking about the meaning of life. You can't really avoid it, right? This is what you have to be addressing and thinking about. And that's part of the joy of the book. And I think that's part of what is appealing about these extreme narratives.
Yeah, you can't avoid the hard questions when
You
you're
can't avoid
faced,
the hard questions. That's
when
right.
you're faced with things like that. And I like that it forces a person to go to that place. And so, yeah. And I like the way that just on a sort of technical level, how you can describe the natural world in ways that maybe evade traditional concepts of beauty or the sublime.
That's exactly right. And that's one of the things about your book. I mean, you avoid the cliches of that sort of experience that I think we're expecting when we read it, so that the imagery is fresh and the perspective of this character is fresh. Beth asks, do you know anyone in your own life who's voluntarily lived off the grid, away from community?
I certainly do. Yes, I've lived in some remote places in Wyoming, for example, and in Colorado, and within those places you could meet people who lived even more remotely. And I don't think I've ever successfully lived off the grid. I think I was always hooked up in one way or another, but pretty far out. Nothing like Sven deals with, but there are still places in Wyoming where there's no electricity, there's no plumbing, and I know some folks who've lived out there for years and dedicated their lives to that sort of life.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you're not off the grid now, but for someone who lives in New York City, as I do at the moment, you are, you're fairly remote.
It's true. And some would say too, my wife might say too remote. And as someone who rarely comes down off our hill, I would say maybe not quite remote enough, but one must find some compromises in life.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So Karen Hogland asks, are you a fan of the Norwegian writer Karl Ove Knausgaard's autofiction, My Struggle?
I'm going to just come right out and admit that I tried and failed to read the first book of My Struggle. And though I admire him greatly for his technical skills and his bravery in exposing every gruesome detail of his life, and I think he's also very funny. I particularly like his criticism that he writes for papers and magazines. But I find that certain forms of autofiction, like his, they feel like a test that the reader must take, or a trick to see how long are you willing to read this book, and just how much will you sit through before anything happens. And for me, I failed that test after about half a book. If I feel that I'm being dragged along at this truly snail's pace without any concrete momentum or change, I get a little frustrated, but I do admire him from a distance. My mother adores him. She's read every single one.
What have you read lately that you loved?
I mean, beyond the Exiles?
Oh, well, that was of course, a prompt for you to say. No. No. What have you read? What have you read recently that you really liked?
Well, so I just am rereading Adam Johnson's Fortune Smiles, and marveling at his abilities. And not too long ago, I actually listened, I didn't read, but I listened to Little Dorrit for the first time ever. And that was one that had somehow slipped my attention in the Dickens canon. And I found so much joy and frustration there. I mean, talk about terrible female characters. I mean, just really, really bad at writing female characters. I had this presumptuous, absurd wish that I could edit Dickens. I often have that, both for his representation of women and others, and also just to cut him down. And it felt like he was getting paid by the word or the column inch. And I just want to take some of those running gags and cut them in half. I just read Hard Times as well, which I hadn't read either. But so much to love and admire as well in those books.
All right, Nathaniel, you have just described what I think would be a great LitHub piece. So I'm going to force you to write an article about this for LitHub, and it will be good publicity for your book. So I think it would work. Okay, we have a question that I think might be our last question, I'm afraid to say. Is that right, Rachel? But okay, so it's kind of a fun one to end on. Dogs seem to play an important role in the book. Is this inspired from life?
Oh, yes. As anyone will know who's found their way to that LitHub piece that I wrote about dogs, I'm always looking for dogs written well, dogs as fully developed characters instead of plot devices. In trying to achieve that, I attempted this sort of act of magic, trying to immortalize my dogs. One who's no longer with us, and the other who's, I don't know if you can see him. He's right down there.
Aw, yes.
That's Bonaparte. He's the model for Sixten, Sven's second dog. Yeah, he knows we're talking about him. But anyway, yes, I'm a dog lover, and I appreciate their idiosyncrasies, how each one is completely different from the other.
Oh, that's so great. Well, this has been so much fun for me. I hope it's been fun for everyone else as well. Nathaniel, you're so, again, the book is so spectacular. I really loved it. I've been recommending it to everyone and talking it up wherever I go. I just did a New York Librarians Association luncheon and I held up your book.
Fantastic.
But anyway, it's delightful to be able to talk with you tonight. And thank you both from Northshire Books for allowing me to take part.
Thank you guys so much. And thank you, Christina. What an honor.
Nathaniel, Christina, thank you both so much. This has been an absolute delight this evening, and congratulations on the #1 Indie Next pick for November. And
Yay.
order the Memoirs of Stockholm Sven from Northshire. We put the link in the chat. Have a wonderful night, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good night, everybody.